This is a case that, according to Manchester's book, The Highgate Vampire, which I purchased, I bought, I read and reread this book, the case genesis, according to his rendition, begins in 1967 with two young schoolgirls who are passing, I believe it was the North Gate, by Swan's Lane near the Highgate Cemetery. Swain's Lane.
Yeah.
And they were engulfed with visions of corpses rising from their graves. Is that pretty much it in a nutshell?
That's it. At least that's what Manchester says in his book. Yes, that's fair.
Okay, now let's get down to some specifics. The two young ladies in question now you were a part of this from the get-go. Did you ever have any contact or meet or speak with either of these young ladies?
I spoke with one of them, yeah. One of the ladies who Manchester names in his book, I think he's called Elizabeth Virgilia. I only hesitate on that because it's a Polish name. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but he puts her name in his book and he spells it. He claims at a later date, she actually, in the book he claims that she was losing her appetite and that she'd been bitten by a vampire.
Yes.
This girl Elizabeth was living with somebody called who Manchester called Brother Keith. Manchester went round to the house and he gave Brother Keith some specific instruction. Anyway, he saved her by putting crucifixes around the doors and the windows, adorning her with garlic, and keeping an eye on her. And he actually said to Brother Keith, he said, he claims that he was successful on that occasion. He said, but she's still very weak, so just make sure you keep feeding her on nourishing broth, and she'll be okay. Yeah? Now, the evidence to back that up, in the book, Manchester puts a picture of Elizabeth. Elizabeth, is that okay?
Sure.
He puts a picture in the book of Elizabeth with two bite marks on her neck. Do you remember seeing that in the book?
No, that was, from what I understand, in the first edition that was removed in the edition I have.
Oh, that's right, yeah. Well, anyway, in the first edition, he put a picture of Elizabeth, a close-up with these two bite marks on her neck. I think you're right there. He didn't include that in the second edition. And the reason he probably didn't include that photo was back in '79, when I realised, after what Manchester was doing with that tape and how he was treating me, a colleague of mine actually phoned up Elizabeth at her workplace, and at the time she was living in Barnet, and she was working at a big firm called Thompson's Travel. Now, I actually recorded this, and my friend is actually Australian, which is really good because her accent helped considerably. She spoke directly to Elizabeth, and she said, I've just come back from Australia, which was actually true. She hadn't been in the country that long, and she said, I'm trying to find Mr. Manchester. I'm trying to locate him, but he doesn't seem to be at his old address. Elizabeth said, well, I haven't seen him for about 5 years now. But remember, this was in 1979. And she said, so, is there any truth in the fact? Because Manchester had been putting a story around that she had been bitten by a vampire. And Elizabeth actually said to my friend, she burst out laughing and she said, no, she said, Sean made those marks on my neck for a joke. And the reason she said that, my friend said, because I've seen a picture of you, which she had. There was a book published in 1974 by Peter Underwood, the occult writer.
Yes.
And ghost author.
Which, incidentally, Mr. Manchester uses his name quite prominently on his website.
Yes, I know.
In order to give more credence to this vampire mythology, I believe.
That's right, yes, he does. But the point is, Underwood used this picture of Elizabeth with the two so-called vampire marks on her neck in the first edition of his self-published book, The Highgate Vampire, which came out in 1985. It had already been used in the 1974 Peter Underwood book. Peter Underwood included a chapter by Manchester on the Highgate vampire, and he virtually said the same thing, that she'd been bitten by a vampire and he saved her. So, to reiterate, when my friend, actually she said to Elizabeth, she said, well, I've seen a picture of you in the book. And Elizabeth hadn't actually seen the book, and she described it, and then she burst out laughing, and she said, oh no, she said, Sean made those marks on my neck just for a joke.
Well, now, you know, from the standpoint as a detective, a former police criminal investigator, when I read this book, David, the first thing that popped into my mind, because in the book there is a young woman that Manchester identified under the pseudonym of Lucia.
Yeah.
That he is alleging later came under attack by this vampire from Highgate.
Yeah.
Ended up dying, was buried, and then rose from the grave. Hey, I'm not making this up.
I know you're not.
No, I'm telling the audience. This they're going to think that I've lost my mind. But
yeah, I know.
But she arose from the grave, and then she was preying upon the public at large. And, you know, according to what he wrote in the book, thankfully near the end of the story, he tracks her down. She attacks him. He's able to fend her off. And before it's all said and done, this young woman, who's a vampire, turns into a giant spider. And he stakes the spider, and she achieves the true death and reverts back to form, and he reburies her.
That's correct, yeah.
Now, as a cop, okay, I got to tell you, when I read that, the first thing that came into my mind was, okay, if there was any part of this that was true, okay, and I'm looking at it from a logical, investigatory standpoint, I want to find out what this woman's name was, track down her certificate of death, okay, and start the investigation from that point. Now, for years, David, I wanted to find out what her name was, and I never could track down. Now, I have a very close, very dear friend in the UK who is a renowned paranormal investigator, Mr. John Spencer. And John has been banging around all types of cases many years, he and his wife, Ann. And John, I got in touch with John, and he knew about my interest in this case. And he said, well, you know, I don't know if there's anything I can do, but let me see. And he, of course, could come up with nothing. So it was not until a few months ago, just by the purest chance, I found a radio broadcast that you did here in the States with a couple of guys where you identified this woman by name.
That's right, yeah.
Jacqueline Cooper.
That's right, yeah.
Now, when I heard that, I thought, aha, all right, now we can get somewhere. And I sent this information to my friend, and that's when I asked to get in touch with you, and I asked if he could make an introduction. Now, as an aside, and I've already kind of mentioned this at the beginning of the show, for those people that don't know it, I am a published novelist. I wrote a book called Past Sins. Yes, I'd love you to buy it, but not here to push the book. But on a chat list on Amazon USA, a horror chat, I was discussing vampires, vampire literature, and I mentioned the Highgate case. And I had told everybody I was talking to, well, you know, I'm a former police investigator, and I've always had an interest in this allegedly very real case of a supernatural vampire. And for years I've been trying to find out what this person's name was. And finally, lo and behold, it's literally as a gift, it dropped in my lap by David Farrant, who has been a part of this case going back all those years, along with Sean Manchester. Now, it was not a day or maybe 2 days later, suddenly I'm hit with a flurry of very angry emails. Very angry, demanding that I remove all reference to this woman's name. Now, if it would have come from that woman, I would have understood it, but it came from an unnamed source from the Friends of Bishop Sean Manchester. Now, I got to tell you, immediately flags raised. Flags raised. Why would, this unnamed person, and if it were, in fact, Bishop Manchester, I could even understand that. But finally, after telling them, look, if you want to talk to me, give me your name, and then I'll talk to you, this person identified herself as Katrina Garforth-Bles.
KGB for short, yeah.
KGB for short, right.
Yeah.
So I had a series of emails that we exchanged, and finally, and I'm trying to be humorous, I said, well, under the guise of furthering Anglo-American relations, I will remove that reference. And then they said something to me along the lines of, because I said, well, I would still like to talk to Bishop Manchester. And I got a note back, and they said, well, I don't know why he would want to talk to to some American that smeared him, because basically in this chat, I had said, well, for somebody to believe in super vampires, they're either taking opportunity to a new level, an opportunist, or they've got to be deluded. And she threw this back in my face. Now, the first thing that hit me was, why in the hell would some group in the UK be worried about a chat list here in the United States? Unless they, I don't know, have spies all over the world? KGB? I mean, you tell me, David.
Well, you've already summarised basically what Manchester said in the first edition and the second. Incidentally, have you been lucky enough, or rather, sorry, have you been unlucky enough to read Manchester's first edition?
No, I've
okay.
Actually, that's the original book I wanted to get my hands on.
Yeah. Well, I might be able to loan you my copy, but we'll have to arrange that in private, obviously not over the air, but I have got a copy of it myself. The whole point is, in that book, this girl, Lucia, real name Jacqueline Cooper, in the first edition of the book, there is quite a few pictures, I'm not sure how many, maybe 7 or 8 pictures, of Lucia with accompanying caption, which clearly identify her as Lucia, the girl that was attacked by the vampire and was to eventually have been staked by Manchester. For some reason, most of those pictures have all been taken out of Manchester's second edition. It's only left one in there, which I think is on page 72, and the caption to that is, it shows a girl, yes, that is Lucia, and she's pointing to the doors of a vault where Manchester claims in the book he followed her when she was sleepwalking.
Yes,
and
yes.
So he puts that down as the vault of the Highgate vampire where it was sleeping, if you like.
Yes.
And he goes on in the book, this is another part of the story, how eventually he traced this king vampire to a deserted manor house in Crouch End, and there he staked it through the heart after dragging it. Oh, he found it there in a coffin. He dragged it out in the overgrown back garden. He staked it through the heart, upon which it turned to a mass of slime and sluggish viscera in the bottom of the casket. He was with one other person called Arthur, he claims. Then they set light to the coffin. Oh, and I forgot to mention, when he staked it, he says in the book, a terrible roar. It emitted a terrible roar, as if from the bowels of hell. Anyway, they fetched petrol from the car. They poured it over the car.
Now, for all our American listeners, fetching petrol from the car, gasoline.
I'm sorry, I should have said gasoline. I forgot I'm an American. Okay, end of the Highgate vampire. But the only thing is, this vampire was, before its unfortunate demise by Manchester, was supposed to have bitten a girl, and who herself had turned into a vampire, who in turn was called Lucia.